Welcome, everyone. As you join, please feel free to share where you're calling us from. We'll probably wait about 4 minutes more before we get started, just giving people a chance to join from other sessions or from their daily lives.
Oh, more Seattle, go Dogs.
Argentina. That's awesome. Hey, Joaquin. If you've been to more sessions today, let us know how many you've been and whether there's been any highlights so far.
Yeah, what's been everyone's favorite one? Besides this one, of course.
Yeah, I was gonna say I may be biased, but I really enjoy the one that we did with Steve. It was very, very, very thoughtful approach to talking about the relationship between designers and engineers. And
Oh yeah,
how to
the
think.
compiler generation? Is that what it was called? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
It's a great topic.
Totally, yeah. You're too nice, Steve. Hey, Rui from Portugal. As more people start joining us, please feel free to share where you're calling us from. And if you've been to other sessions today, we'd love to hear what your thoughts have been so far and how many you've attended. Okay, so I figure we can get started. Just wanted to welcome everyone and just say thanks for joining us today. This will be the last session for Friends of Figma World Tour. And, as people continue to join, just feel free to say hi on the chat. Leave us a note where you're tuning in from. We want to hear how many sessions you attended today and where you're calling us from. With that said, wanted to quickly introduce myself. For the ones who don't know me yet, my name is Pablo. I'm the co-founder of a tech recruiting startup called Slope, based in Seattle. And we work with early stage startups, primarily pre-seed to Series A, on helping them hire their first 10 engineers. When I started this journey 4 years ago, I knew it was going to be lonely as a designer. I've been in the design industry for 10 plus years, and coming out of another startup where I was also a founding designer. So again, very lonely. I moved to Seattle back in 2021 and wanted to be part of a larger community, and saw that Friends of Figma didn't have a chapter in the Seattle area, which was very surprising to me. But I applied to it, and I've been running the community since. And I've been really passionate about creating spaces where designers can connect and share their knowledge, learn from each other, and grow together. So really thrilled to be hosting this event today. This initiative, it's been a 24-hour nonstop virtual celebration of the Friends of Figma community around the world. This event has been built on true global collaboration. So every participating Friends of Figma chapter has hosted a 1-hour session featuring local speakers, local insights, and community-led content. The goal has been to celebrate the richness and diversity of our global community while making the sessions accessible to anyone, anywhere. And it's been a powerful reminder to know what we can achieve together. So today, I'm really excited to be presenting Jen Spriggs. One of my favorite things of running the Friends of Figma community is being, getting to know and meeting incredible designers that are local to Seattle. So I connected with Jen about a month ago, I want to say, with the idea of running more events, and then the idea of Friends of Figma World Tour came by, and was really excited to invite Jen to be a speaker today. So anyway, I'm sure you'll be able to do a much better job introducing yourself, Jen. So I'll pass it to you from here. A couple things that I wanted to highlight, though. At the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A, and we'll also be giving away a $50 gift card from the Friends of Figma, from the Figma store, for the person who had the best questions. So, as Jen goes through her presentation, please feel free to add your questions in the chat. I'll make sure to flag them near the end. But if there's anything you'll need from me, I'll be here. But for now, I'll just go in silent. And Jen, please take it from here.
Great. Hey, everybody. I'm going to make sure that I'm spotlit so I can control the presentation. Great. So hey, everybody. I'm Jen Spriggs. I'm chatting with you today from my studio here in Seattle. My day job, I'm currently a staff designer at CNN, which is a news network here in the United States and also internationally, if you guys aren't familiar. I'm a product designer there. I work with the journalists to help them create the best tool that we can have to help them produce the news. So I get to work a lot with the journalists and some other product designers to help make a really cool CNN reader experience. But I've been a product designer now for about 9 years. But I have a sort of interesting background that brought me to product design that I'll get into in a bit. But today we're going to be talking about design critique, the practice of design critique, how to do it, and I'm going to give you some best practices in order to use Figma more optimally to make your design critiques better as a team. So I would bet that most of us have been in design critiques that felt more like interrogations than collaborations, where feedback actually gets personal. Maybe there's awkward silences that drag on, or someone even demolishes your work without offering anything constructive. I have been there. I've been there a lot. And today I'm going to be talking about things that could potentially help mitigate that. So in the anti-villain design guide, it's going to be full of practical guidelines for creating motivating and inspiring critique experiences that hopefully serve to strengthen team bonds and improve your work as a designer, also using Figma's collaborative features effectively. But by the end, I'm hoping that you're going to have concrete strategies to make every critique that you have a little bit more productive, supportive primarily, and also hopefully a lot more enjoyable. Great. So why should you even listen to me about the subject? Well, I have worked across a lot of companies of all sizes. So working at really big companies like Microsoft, Google, sort of medium-sized companies like Dropbox, and very small startups like Replit. And I've witnessed some truly excellent critiques, ones that I still remember today and are really formative to my growth as a designer, which is why I really believe in this practice. But I've also seen some truly dysfunctional critiques and critique cultures, the kind that make you really dread Monday morning design reviews or like the critique meetings that you have during the week. At Dropbox, I actually got to redesign our entire team critique process, which is actually what sparked this presentation and sort of my interest in the subject matter beyond just like loving the practice itself. I went through design school twice, so I've experienced critique from both sides, the brutal design school pinups and the corporate conference room variety. But bottom line, I've facilitated hundreds of critiques and learned what creates productive conversations versus just what creates anxiety. The formative experience that I draw from most is my early career as a fashion designer. So my undergrad is actually in fashion design. That was the first round of design school that I went through. I spent several years designing apparel for Abercrombie and Fitch and American Eagle. Maybe some of you have even worn some of the clothing that I've made. But designing for physical products is very, very different from designing for digital products. The stakes, I would say, are pretty incredibly high. You can't take back a mistake that's on shelf or built into thousands of items. See the men's boxers on the right of the screen. We actually held some of our most critical critique sessions for these exact prints and patterns. The seasonal success of these entire product lines that sometimes accounted for millions of dollars came down to those critique meetings where we threw up our prints on the wall and sort of decided what was going to be in the season for the next season. So critique was essential to our process in fashion, but I witnessed a lot of toxic behavior, as you can imagine. You can imagine like devil wears Prada style attitudes. But when I transitioned to tech, I loved the overall culture, but found the critique process were often a little bit weak, maybe a little too nice, maybe a little bit not rigorous enough. But I don't want things to be like of the realm of what I experienced in fashion, of course. Um, and I was inspired to improve critique culture in tech by drawing from fashion's high craft standards, while ditching the destructive behaviors that I saw in the fashion studio. So for this project, when I initially did it at Dropbox, I actually chatted with fashion designers about their critique experience at work, as well as designers from several other industries, some folks that I knew from my own network. So I got to talk up to architects, furniture makers, motion designers, branding, and another motion designer to help glean best practices for building these guidelines. Because I wanted to learn what was working and what wasn't working in their practices. So what struck me was how consistent the patterns were across disciplines. So whether someone was critiquing a building design, a piece of furniture, or a digital interface, the same fundamental principles kept surfacing in every conversation. So the framework I'm sharing with you today isn't just based on my experience in the tech industry, it's built from the best practices that work across several creative fields. And I'll show you how to apply these universal principles to help avoid becoming the session's villain. So let's define critique. Ian Lynham, author of Critique, The War of Design, which is a really great zine. It's like a little book that I would definitely recommend looking up and potentially purchasing. It might be sold out on his website, but he has a bunch of other really great books that you can find at a website called Drawdown, which has a lot of really great books for the design industry. But he puts it perfectly in his book. Critique is what happens when a group meets to analyze a design project, to assess it in regard to challenges and merits, and to offer potential advice and suggestions as to how a design might be improved. This is a little bit academic, but it sounds pretty straightforward. You get together as a team, evaluate what's working, what isn't, figure it out, why, and discuss how to improve to better meet your goals. So while the definition sounds pretty simple, the execution rarely is. There's a reason Ian called his book The War of Design. Critique can quickly become an emotional battlefield if you're not careful, and if you don't have the right framework in place. So I'm betting most of you have encountered some critique villains along the way that prove my point. To get a little real, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation here in the chat. But I'd love to know if you've met any villains in critique, in design critique, and I'd love to know like what kinds. I'm going to pause here because I kind of want to see if people like are brave enough to contribute.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Jen, happy to also bring anyone to the stage if it's
Yeah.
easier to have a conversation out loud rather than through the chat. So just let me know and I'll bring you up.
Direction. I don't like this here for sure. Offering suggestions without sort of offering the rationale behind the suggestion, or without offering the why behind why they're making that suggestion or feedback. Can definitely be pretty irritating. Thanks, Jack. Well, I'm guessing you guys can keep chatting. Why not make all our buttons orange? Love that. Yes. Why don't we move it here? Yeah, these are all great ones. Why are we doing this feature? We should stop all design work on this. It's a terrible one to receive when you're really, really late in the process. Yeah, bluntly saying this is awful. That's like really one to make you sort of want to shrink out of the room. But critiquing a wireframe like a finished design, we're going to be talking about that. Yeah, that's a really irritating piece of feedback when you're not even in the appropriate phase. But yeah, I'm guessing we're hearing about like things like nitpickers who obsess over font choices at inappropriate phases, the person who suggests maybe starting completely over right before a deadline, or like the classic, I just don't like it contributor who offers zero rationale for their feedback. These are all great responses, but we've all been there. And I'm really glad that you guys have. I mean, sorry, I'm not glad that you've had these experiences, but I'm glad that we have the camaraderie in the room, at least that we've all sort of been through like a non optimal critique experience. So the good news is that most critique villains, I think, are not actually bad people. They're just operating without a good framework. A framework can help you provide a framework you can provide as a person receiving the critique. Because there's also sort of a responsibility on us as a person that wants to receive that critical feedback to help guide the audience. And that's what we're going to explore today with some practical guidelines. So I'm going to introduce you to three critique villains that I often see in the field. And you need to watch out for. But these characters show up everywhere. And once you know their patterns, you'll start to spot them immediately. So first is, I think what Bridget was talking about, which is the scope creep. They're always suggesting changes that don't match your project phase. You'll hear them say things like, why don't we rebrand instead? When you're in final polish, or let's go back to research when you're already in development, sort of trying to throw the entire project off rails. And then there's the time thief. They either hijack the session or create impossible time pressure. They'll launch into this reminds me of a project until a 10-minute story or panic everyone with quick feedback on 15 screens. We have 2 minutes. And then there's the context killer. So they force you to spend your whole meeting on background instead of critique. You'll hear, wait, what's this project about? Or can you explain how we got here, from someone who should have prepped beforehand, or someone who potentially wasn't listening to your context. Or this can even happen when you, as a presenter, may not be providing enough context or just enough context. So here's what makes these villains particularly dangerous. They work together. When designers keep encountering these characters, critiques start feeling pointless, participation drops, and eventually work ships with subpar quality because people just stop showing up. And can you really blame them? But the good news, once you spot them, you can stop them. But I have to emphasize that villains aren't just in the audience. Sometimes the presenter can be the villain too. We might be all guilty of this at least at some point. But this is the presenter villain, or at least like one of the characteristics of what could be the presenter villain. They show up with a messy Figma file, no clear direction, and expect the audience to sort of magically know what kind of feedback they need. So here's the thing, as a presenter, you do have a responsibility to come as prepared as you can to direct the crowd towards the specific feedback you want. If you don't know what you need from the session, how can your audience possibly help you? You don't have to have the cleanest file in the world, but you should consider building in some wayfinding to help your audience, because that's really going to help you achieve what you need from that meeting. A messy, unorganized presentation leads to messy and focused feedback, and the presenter villain wastes everyone's time because they haven't done the work to make the session productive. But there are ways that you can mitigate this, even with just a minimal amount of work. Because I do believe that people should feel comfortable coming to critique with messy files, with messy thoughts, but just providing even just a little bit direction to your audience, I think can help like increase the positive outcomes of these sessions. So let's talk about becoming a critique champion and why you would even want to put in the work to do so. So what is in it for you? So when you master productive critique, you unlock three major benefits. First, well, among many, these are just three among, I think, a plethora of benefits that you get from design critique as a practice if you are engaging with it as a designer. So first, and I think a really, really important aspect of design critique is upskilling. So you're constantly learning from your peers, and the critique sessions sort of offer you this predictable way to do that weekly. You'll find yourself saying things like, I never thought of that approach, or this technique could solve my other project too. So this cross-pollination of ideas accelerate your growth as a designer. I know one thing that I really, really like to do as a designer is to talk shop with the other people around me. I think even way back when we were using Illustrator and Adobe tools, like some of my favorite like tricks that I've learned and in Figma now come from my colleagues, and something that I've learned in a critique session from them when I'm like, oh, I really didn't like that technique that you're doing. Like, how are you doing that? Which can then like prove to up level your own work. So second is vision clarity. especially when that psychological bond of trust has been built amongst your teammates. But they can help you break through your creative blocks. So, both for yourself and others. Champions can ask questions like, what if we flip this interaction? Or have you tried this alternative? Um, these fresh perspectives unlock solutions that might not emerge working solo. And that's a really great reason to come to critique and use critique, is when you are kind of stopped at a part in your process or part in your project where you just can't open your vision or unlock your vision to see what is beyond, or you've gotten to a point in your iterating where you're just like, I feel like I'm out of options. I don't know where to go. It's a great time to bring your work to critique to see like what the minds in the room think. And third, and I think this is the more crucial thing that sort of builds alignment across an entire like product, um, or like software suite, or all of the folks that are working on these products, is team alignment. So everyone starts understanding the reasoning behind design decisions. So you'll hear champions say that aligns with our research findings, or now I see why we're prioritizing this. This builds real trust and eliminates unnecessary revisions. Um, being a critique champion isn't just about being nice, it's about becoming a better designer while making everyone else's work more effective around you as well. And the best part is that these behaviors are definitely learnable. So, this is sort of an abstract diagram that shows why I think critique matters so much in our work. As projects progress from left to right, the stakes get exponentially higher. So you can see that with these big growing green circles. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever played like the video game Katamari Damacy, but it's that video game where you sort of like roll up a ball amongst like lots of objects in a room, and your ball grows like progressively bigger. That's kind of how a project feels when you are working on it at a company. Sometimes even large or small. As you sort of like build this project, as it gets more complex, you're sort of like picking up new stakeholders and new project complexity on your like Katamari Damacy ball. So as the projects progress, the stakes get higher, and it's expensive to build stuff. And it's even more expensive to scrap it later in the process. So imagine like trying to pick apart your ball when it's like in the later phases of your work. Um, each of these colored dots represent different types of critique touch points, because there's lots of different type of critique. The black dots are informal conversations that can happen over Slack, one-on-one with your teammates. The light greens are one-on-one desk crits. Blue represents group design critiques with your design colleagues. And the dark green circles are meant to represent those formal design reviews that may happen with like your cross-functional partners or even leadership. So these critique sessions act as checkpoints that help us catch potential issues before they become costly problems. So it's much better to pivot again during these early wireframe, earlier phases before you've built the entire feature. So today I'm going to be mostly focusing on those blue dots, the group design critique, because I think this is where most teams struggle, but it's also where you can kind of get the biggest impact for improving your overall design process. But I think a lot of these guidelines can also work for those other critique types, like those one-on-one sessions, or even like a simple Slack message. So to get practical about critique, before we dive into the deeper guidelines, let's cover the basic logistics that sort of set you up for success to have a good meeting. First, I think it's really important to schedule a consistent 1 hour or more meeting. So try to make this midweek. I don't think anybody likes a critique on a Monday when they're still sort of getting their bearings for the week, or Friday when they're sort of like mentally checking out. My favorite days to have a critique meeting are Wednesdays or Thursdays, sort of in the middle of the week when people are sort of had time to marinate on the work that they've been working on that week. Second, I think it's really important to assign a facilitator. And I really think the key to this is also rotating that role among team members to avoid having managers do it. This gives individual contributors dedicated weekly practice to developing their leadership and facilitation skills. This is something that I really reinforced in my critique sessions at Dropbox, because I thought it would be really helpful for folks on my team to have that sort of time to become a better facilitator to even help their individual career growth. I also thought it was really important that the facilitator of the meeting wasn't a manager, wasn't an authority figure, because I thought that could sort of like upset the vibe of the meeting itself and sort of decrease the psychological safety of the folks in the room. And it sort of like reinforced that this is sort of a colleague-driven environment. So third, ask for participation ahead of time. I think it's also very important to keep everything as low paperwork as possible. I think most of the logistics of scheduling and sort of getting people involved in critique can be handled over Slack or whatever your company's messenger of choice is. But having people sign up like the day or a couple of hours beforehand or the morning of and asking them to roughly estimate how much time they need can really help like the logistics of this meeting. I think it helps you figure out how many people can present in that, however long you decide your meeting to be as well. So these logistics seem basic, but they're crucial. When the operational stuff runs pretty smoothly, you can focus on actual critique instead of figuring out who's presenting or how much time is left. I think it also just helps like build that psychological safety in the room. It's already sort of a scary thing and a vulnerable thing to share your work. But if the rest of the pieces of the meeting feel predictable and familiar, I think a lot of people start to feel more comfortable sharing more. So this brings us to our first major guideline. As a presenter, it's very, very important to add direction. So remember our presenter villain who shows up with a messy file and says, "So what do you think?" This is some simple steps of how to avoid being that person. So as a presenter, you need to give your audience somewhere to focus their energies because a sprawling, disorganized Figma file sort of forces people to spend their mental energy just trying to understand what they're looking at instead of giving you useful feedback. That way, that's how you sort of create that villain, the context killer. They're going to be the ones that are going to be trying to navigate your file and sort of like poke holes in it just because they don't like quite understand it or they just don't know where to start. So a simple Figma tip that makes a huge difference also while you're presenting, and one that I am always really surprised that I don't see a lot of when I see people present their work, is to use the spotlight feature. This is when you're presenting to ensure that everyone is literally looking at the same thing that you're talking about. So no more can everyone see my cursor or people getting lost in a complex file. You kind of know that everyone's being brought along with you. It's like personally one of my favorite features in Figma. I also sometimes will, if I see someone in a file, I will spy on them by like clicking on their little face pile to follow them around the file. It's probably rude, but beyond the technical setup, I think you need to be clear, very important to be very clear about what kind of feedback you want. So are you looking for high level concept validation? Is the project in an early, ambiguous, messy space? Or do you need detailed interaction feedback on a specific flow or specific set of steps? Or even visual design polish. Are you confused about what blue to use? Do you not know what amount to round a corner? Tell your audience up front so they can focus on their critique where it's most helpful. When you add clear direction, you help sort of start to defeat those villains, the context killer and the scope creep before they can even get started. Especially if you've already established what you want from the audience, it's a lot easier to sort of like guide them back to it if they're starting to go off the rails. So this is a simple framework that I like to use. I think about it as presentation Mad Libs. So this 4-sentence structure gives your audience exactly what they need to provide focused and relevant feedback. I sometimes include this directly into my files in a frame or in a section next to all of the frames that I want to present. This is really, really helpful, especially if you're trying to leave behind like an asynchronous artifact that others can critique on, especially if you're running asynchronous critiques. But start with your user problem. Our customers struggle with blank. This sets the context and reminds everyone what we're trying to solve. So don't assume people just remember the background, even if you've just presented this project before. Next, your hypothesis. And my thought is, this is your proposed solution or approach. Be clear about what you're testing or exploring. Then the project phase, very important. We're here in the discovery phase or lo-fi phase or implementation phase. This is very crucial because it tells people what kind of feedback is appropriate. So if you're in discovery, don't nitpick button colors. If you're in implementation, don't suggest a completely separate concept pivot. And then finally, your specific ask. And I would like feedback on the concept or the user flow, whatever it is that you are scoping this feedback to. This directs people's energy towards what's most helpful for your next steps. So this framework takes about like 30 seconds to deliver, but it prevents so much wasted time. And you can even add this directly to your Figma file so the context is always visible. It also provides a really great sort of like breadcrumb trail for you to refer to when you are like summarizing a project or going back and looking at the history of a project, or again, if people are looking at your files asynchronously. So let's talk about the presenter's role during the critique itself a little bit more. So even with great preparation, receiving feedback can feel pretty vulnerable, which is very, very normal. You put a lot of thought and effort into this work, and now people are going to poke holes in it. Um, these were really interesting insights that actually came out of the research study when I talked to all of the like different design disciplines about their work and their design critique practices. Everybody feels vulnerable sharing their work. It's very, very hard to get away from as a designer, as like a professional in this space. It's just something that you have to sort of like grow to get used to, and try to like abandon your ego a little bit. Um, but first, provide rationale for your decision. So this is going to be really helpful for your audience understanding of why you made certain decisions. So when someone questions a choice you made, you should be ready to explain it or explain your thinking. Was there user research that influenced your approach, past experience with similar problems, technical constraints? Even if you're just designing on vibes, you should be upfront about that. And that's okay too, because maybe vibes can be based on some conviction or some like intuition, right? A good presenter can defend their decisions without being defensive about them. So this connects directly to that Mad Libs framework we just covered. When you've already explained your hypothesis up front, it's easier to have rational discussions about whether your solution is working. So second, very important, very hard, but you should be open and try to detach your ego as much as possible. I think this is very, very hard. And this was like articulated as being hard across all of the disciplines that I talked to. Try not to take the feedback personally. Remember, when you're working on goal-oriented projects, their critique is about whether the work solves the problem, not about you as a designer. And this gets much easier when your colleagues are judging the work and not the designer, which is exactly what we'll cover in our guidelines for giving feedback, which are next. But as the presenter, it's your job to stay curious about what your team is seeing that you might have missed. So flip to the other side, because there's a really, really great responsibility to being a good critic, and avoid being one of those three villains. So these 4 principles will help turn you into that champion that we've been talking about. So first, very, very important to be goal-oriented. So this is your secret weapon against the scope creep. You should always ground your feedback in the project's actual goals. So ask yourself, does the solution solve the problem that was presented? Does it meet the product and engineering requirements? Focus on whether the work is achieving what it set out to do, not whether you would have fundamentally approached it differently. Second, be focused and efficient. So this defeats the time thief. Make your feedback clear, concise, and appropriate for the project phase. Avoid vague language like "this doesn't feel right." Be specific about what you're seeing and why it matters. This actually helps you develop a better design vocabulary. So as a critic, it is really important to not be vague, because you will not be sort of like growing in your in the language that you're using to describe not only the work that you're seeing, but your own work as well. And third, convey a trusting and respectful tone. This is really important. It's very important to assume that your colleagues are competent designers who took an earnest stab at the solution. There's going to be multiple ways to solve any design problem, so approach critique with curiosity rather than judgment, especially because you might learn something from their work as well. And finally, my favorite term that I learned from an architect that I was talking to when I was doing the study is to avoid bike shedding, which is our tendency to focus on trivial details while ignoring bigger problems. It's called bike shedding because when architects are designing and building a skyscraper, there can be a tendency to want to focus on the bike shed that accompanies the skyscraper, because those decisions to build the bike shed are a lot easier than the decisions you have to tackle when building the skyscraper. But it can become very like obvious, I think, when people are sort of tackling those smaller, easier to make decisions and like maybe tackling the elephant in the room. So when you follow these principles, you're not just giving better feedback, you're modeling that behavior that creates that healthy critique culture. So let's get tactical a little bit about using Figma's commenting feature to make your critique a bit more organized and actionable. I like to use a 4 simple category framework that helps everybody prioritize their feedback effectively. I learned this while I was at Dropbox. One of the pain points of critique is that the person receiving the critique may not know how to prioritize the feedback that they're getting. You could use sort of like a hierarchical framework to say like, I'm always going to prioritize the feedback of my manager, which you maybe you should. And then like leadership, and then you sort of like stack rank all of the feedback that you're getting from amongst the room. But this, as a critic, also kind of helps you sort of self-prioritize your feedback. So first is major. These are critical issues. So these would be things like overlapping work with other teams. If you work at a really large company, maybe someone's tackling the same problem and it's worth sort of like aligning with that other team. Accessibility concerns or engagement risks. You should flag these with major so the presenter knows that these need immediate attention. So for example, we notice this pattern tends to impact click behavior. Second, minor feedback. These are small refinements. So spacing adjustment or slight color changes, label them with minor so the presenter can tackle them later. Something like minor, can we bump the spacing up from 8 to 16? So this also helps when you might know as a critic that you could be potentially giving critique that might be outside the scope of what the presenter is looking for. You could sort of self-select to say like, this is a minor critique. Maybe it's worth like paying attention to this after you've solved all of these other bigger problems. So third, curious feedback. Use this when you need more context before giving a real opinion. So curious, do we have any data that supports the use of the CTA? This prevents you from making some assumptions and shows you're trying to understand the rationale. This is really helpful if you see something that you like might disagree with, but there might be constraints from the system that you might not be fully aware of. And finally, kudos. I think it's always important to call out what's working well. So something like kudos, love this, love the palette you used, so elegant here. Really don't shy away from positive feedback. It really helps the presenter know what to keep and helps build confidence in the work and just sort of like goes to build that team rapport. This framework helps keep that feedback organized, helps with prioritization, and ensures nothing gets lost in translation. I think plus having it all documented in Figma means the presenter can refer back to it while they're iterating, which is really helpful. If you as a team can help them sort of like self-document or document the critique for them, that's always a plus. So these phrases might seem simple, but they can completely change the tone and effectiveness of your feedback. So instead of saying, I don't like this or this doesn't work, try, I appreciate how you, this acknowledges the thoughts and effort that went into the work before you offer suggestions for improvement. And it also, how about, can you tell me more about? Is perfect when you want to understand the rationale behind a decision before jumping to conclusions. Maybe there's context or constraints you're not aware of. You might experiment with, offers alternatives without being prescriptive. It positions your feedback as options to explore rather than demands to implement. And another approach might be, does sort of the same thing. It suggests possibilities while respecting that there are multiple valid solutions. So all of these phrases assume positive intent and competence. They're curious rather than judgmental, collaborative rather than critical. This language really helps you avoid sounding like the scope creep or any of the other villains, because the way you phrase feedback matters just as much as the content of the feedback itself. These simple shifts in language can transform the entire energy of your critique sessions. So I want to leave you on this last slide with a quote from my friend Colleen, who's a fashion designer who I interviewed for this project. She said, critique is more like a verb than a noun. It's not a destination in my day-to-day job. It's always happening. So I really love this perspective because it captures something essential. Critique isn't just that formal meeting you have once a week. It's something that's woven into how we work, how we think about problems, and how we collaborate with our teams. When you embrace critique as an ongoing practice rather than a dreaded event, everything starts to change. And this is something that I saw at Dropbox as I was redesigning our weekly meeting. I actually had several designers come to me and tell me that this meeting had become their favorite one during the week. And that really meant a lot to me because I felt like we could transform something that some people really feared or felt like sort of dread about into something that they ended up really loving and looked forward to even in the week. So those Figma comments become opportunities for growth. The weekly sessions become the highlight of your week instead of something you try to skip. And you stop seeing feedback as judgment and start seeing it as fuel for better work. So the guidelines we've covered today, from defeating our critique villains to becoming critique champions, these aren't just meeting protocols, they're ways of thinking that can transform your entire design practice. So At the end, I want to say go forth, critique. I want you to be curious, be respectful, be focused. Use Figma's tools to make feedback more organized and actionable. And remember, the best critiques don't just make your work better, they make you a better designer. So, thank you.
Right on. Wow. Thank you so much, Jen. This was incredibly insightful. I feel like I've had to learn the hard way how to ask for feedback properly throughout my career. I wish I would have had these guidelines earlier on. So, uh, super, super helpful, and really appreciate all the knowledge shared. We wanted to open the space for everyone to ask questions. And Jen, if you need to clarify something, happy to bring people to speak out loud. But we would love to hear what everyone's thinking. So feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A section. There was one question that someone dropped in the chat from Bethany. She was saying, how do you prepare for critique when you're the one presenting work that feels unfinished or uncertain?
Yeah.
Are there any other Figma plugins or features you love for a smoother crit?
Yeah, I think if you search Figma community, there are a bunch of like critique frameworks that you can just drop into your files. Plugins, I have to do more investigation about. Before this, I was like frantically like, could I vibe code like a plugin right now to like support my talk? But there might be some cool plugins out there. But when you're the one presenting work that feels unfinished and uncertain, that's totally okay. Like work, it should feel in the majority of the times that you're bringing it to critique sort of unfinished and uncertain, and that's something that you can provide in the sort of framework that you're giving your audience that you are presenting to or wanting to glean insights from or direction from. Often when I'm sort of presenting really early phase ambiguous messy work, I'm saying like, this is really ambiguous, I'm stuck at this certain thing, or I want validation for the direction that I'm iterating towards. And that's definitely something that you can ask your audience. Like sometimes you just kind of want a gut check because you're taking like, I guess what people would call a wag or like a wild A word guess. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. Um, but like sometimes you're taking that first stab right at the problem, and you just need validation that you're going the right direction. So that's like totally fine to bring to critique, I think, as long as you're articulating that.
Right on. We have plenty of questions. So next one from Vivi. How can you deal with never endless critiques when in each one the person gives you something new to add, even
Yeah.
though you had agreed on something before?
Yeah, I think that this definitely depends on the person that's giving you the critique. Like if it's someone that's sort of like an authority figure to you, this could be a really hairy situation to sort of navigate. But as the person receiving the critique, you can also ask for rationale from the person giving you the critique, from your critic. You can say like, "Oh, can you tell me more about that feedback?" and sort of like dig into that feedback to get into the underlying reason why they're giving it. Because sometimes when you sort of probe at that, you're able to like get to the heart of it and like deprioritize it or like argue for a prioritization for that feedback later, depending on what they're telling you. But that can kind of feel endless. And it, I think you also have to be good at like providing your own rationale too, because if you're providing like pretty good rationale, like a reasonable person that's overlooking the work should, I think, be open to that being like the solution to the problem. But sometimes these can be negotiations depending on who like is looking at the work and their relationship to you as a power figure.
Makes sense. Thanks for sharing that, Jen. Another question from Ella. Do you invite stakeholders to your design critiques to get alignment?
Yes, strategically sometimes. I think like critique in its purest form is going to be like your design colleagues just sort of riffing. But I think that there are sessions that you can be really strategic about, by inviting like particular stakeholders. It can be a really nuanced decision that you can make because maybe that stakeholder hasn't ever been in a critique. They may not know the culture, they may not know the language, so they could feel out of their depth. But sometimes it's really helpful to bring those people in the room so they sort of like get a new perspective on like why people are making the decisions that they're making. It could help them see like the work at a higher perspective to see how your work might fit in with like the work of a bunch of other teams too. So sometimes this can be really helpful, or that could be a really helpful way to get a stakeholder more on board.
Right on. Yeah. One question from Lisa here. How do you manage ramblers or those who'd go down a rabbit hole and pull others into the rabbit hole?
Whoa, okay. That's a good question. I mean, time boxing, like establishing that sort of like negotiated time box at the beginning can help sort of navigate that person away from that rabbit hole. And I think like again, like probing the critic for the rationale for their critique. Um, you have to defend your work, but your critics should also have to defend the feedback that they're giving as well. Because if something is like, and that also contributes to like the bike shedding behavior that I was talking about before, right? If someone's going down a rabbit hole, they could be like rabbit holing on the wrong thing. Because I think it's only like ever described as a rabbit hole when it's bad or like going in the wrong direction. So I think like corralling them back as the presenter, as the person wanting the critical feedback is also something that you can do to sort of like mitigate that problem.
Makes sense. One question from Rui. Drawing from the idea of making others feel valued and understood, how do you recommend using empathetic communication to deliver design critiques that not only foster improvement, but also build stronger, more collaborative relationships with designers? Could you share a specific technique or example where this approach turned a potentially tough critique into a positive, motivating experience?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific experience. I mean, there's the critique that people talk about that is sort of, there's like two methods that I talk to. One create brand designer when I was doing the original research for this. She utilizes, of course, like the sandwich technique, which is like saying something that you like about the work and then saying something that you don't like about the work so much, but in like more like empathetic language. Like, oh, can you tell me more about how you approach this? Where did the idea come to use this font? Where did the idea come to use this blue? Things like that, and then also ending on positive critique. Um, I think that's a really helpful framework to use when you might be in a room with people you don't know very well or that you're trying to build rapport with, or if you're like the new person in the room on a new team to you and you don't really know the personalities in the room quite yet. So you don't want to like come out guns blazing, like taking down everyone's work. You kind of want to establish yourself as like a trusting person. And then the other um, method that she also said that she employed was something like it's called yes and, which I think is like a improv technique. So someone who is where like you might not be totally on board with the direction that the project is taking, but you sort of like yes and it anyway to see if you can sort of like take the negotiation of the critique into a new place that like brings you closer to alignment, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah, I love that. Yes, and very powerful in turning negatives to positives. Another question from Andrew. As a project lead, how can I respectfully communicate with leadership when they're bike shedding forward slash commenting on designs that we were not particularly asking for feedback?
yeah, I think if you have established like what the scope of the project is with them, you can sort of tailor or get them back on the rails, as it were. Because that's something that like at the beginning of the presentation, if you're saying this is the scope of the project, this is what I'm looking for feedback on. If you see them commenting on things that are outside of the scope of that project, outside of the scope of what you're looking for, that can become the new conversation. You can say, okay, like I'm noticing that a lot of the conversation or a lot of the feedback is kind of pointed on this thing that isn't something that we're addressing right now. And especially if this is leadership that's making this feedback, you can ask like, is there a concern that we're not focused on the right problem right now? And then the conversation with leadership becomes about what is it that is the problem that we're solving. If someone is like doing the bike shedding behavior, because that like readjusts the focus back on like again that larger problem, the skyscraper problem, versus like some of the smaller problems sort of like at the periphery.
Yeah. JL asks, is it worth documenting a specific critique that didn't get addressed for whatever reason? And if so, like, what's a good approach for it?
Yeah, I think it's helpful. And I think it's helpful when people are doing the self-documenting when they're using the comments. But that might be something that you address like much later. I think that like especially in early project phases, if you are getting like sort of the nitpicky feedback, about certain copy decisions or about certain like layout decisions, it still might serve as a reminder to you to check that before you finalize the design. Because like someone with a nitpick might also be informing you that of things about the design system you might not know. You might be new to the team, you might be new to the design system, or someone might just have better, deeper knowledge of the design system than you. So like say if someone's sort of like nitpicking your design work and they're like, this spacing should be like 16 instead of 8, that I think is still good to have in your back pocket, because you might not even know that like the design requirements of the design system say that like the spacing has to be a certain way. So helpful to just have that stuff, I think, sitting around, even if you don't address it immediately.
Makes sense. One question from Leland. When it comes to critique sessions, do you prefer doing them online or in person? And what do you think makes one more effective than the other?
Oh man, it's been so long since I've had an in-person critique session. I think it's just when I've gone to Bridges. It's like I have such nostalgia for my like critique sessions when I was a fashion designer, just purely because they were physical. But like, there's so much behavior that I would not want to like redo. um, but I don't know if I have like super strong opinions about which one I actually prefer. I think I'm just like sort of anchoring on the nostalgia that I have for like the old like critiques. But there really is nothing like a pinup. Like it is so fun and impressive to like have everything printed out on a wall and to go through it and comb through it and like leave post-it notes and like discuss it sort of like gallery style as if you're an artist. But I think what's helpful about the digital artifacts that we do when we do critiques in Figma is that you can kind of like go back and refer to them at any point. Like pinups, you have to take down eventually, so they were like pretty ephemeral. But like with Figma and with the tools that we have now, we kind of have like a reference point on the work that we're doing that doesn't go away, which is nice.
Yeah, I think the visual aspect also helps when it comes to documentation as well. I think
Mm-hmm.
analog definitely it's like an extra layer. I would think. One question from Bridget here. She'd love to hear your insights into keeping time and topics on track during your critique sessions.
Yeah, I think this also goes back to just making sure that you have an understanding of who's coming to the session and how long it is, and literally having a timer. Like when I was at Draw, I think the most like rigorous I ever was about this was when I was redesigning and sort of like leading this effort at a Dropbox. I had a timer next to me. And we had a really regimented session. Like at the beginning of the session, we always had an icebreaker, which sort of like built rapport amongst the team, which is another tool that you can use in your sort of toolkit of creating critique. But then I would literally like say, oh, the next presenter is blah, 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 15 minutes on the clock. And I would like have that countdown. I kind of wish Zoom, maybe they have this or maybe they haven't implemented this yet, but like they should implement like a clock in the upper right hand corner so like everybody can kind of see the time. Um, but if you can like even integrate that into your process somehow, so like everybody's sort of aware of the time, because it becomes sort of like a way that you respect each other in that time, because everybody should get equal time to get their design evaluated in the way that they need, right? And then at the end of the session, like very crucial, I think, like when time is up as a facilitator, I would always ask the presenter, did you get what you needed? Because you want to make sure that like somebody is leaving that session with with value, like what they came in to answer, the questions that they came in to answer. So if they were to say like no, or if they were to say I need follow up, then you have an answer as to like whether or not that time was spent effectively.
Makes sense. Another question from Shirley. By the way, thanks everyone who's been asking questions. There's so many good ones here. It's
Yeah.
going to be hard to pick a winner. But Shirley was wondering, kind of like outside of Figma specific and with the context that she often collaborates with team members from non-design backgrounds like marketing who are in
Mm-hmm.
charge of creating branded materials.
Mm-hmm.
When she tries to offer design advice based on her experience, it often feels like the feedback really doesn't land or isn't taken seriously, and she worries that she may be too soft in how she delivers it. So,
Mm-hmm.
wondering if you have any experience in similar situations when working with non-designers, and how do you give critique in a way that's constructive, clear, and more likely to be understood and acted on?
Yeah. Team members should okay. This can be really tough because sometimes it just feels like you're not sharing the same vocabulary or like fundamental understanding of like what critique is. But oftentimes, I think people from cross functions can provide you with insight that you might not have had otherwise. And this could also like sit in the realm of like, if they're giving me feedback that feels irrelevant, if someone's giving you feedback that feels irrelevant and they're like not an authority figure to you, you can like, the secret is that you can kind of like always throw that away and be like, well, that's not going to help my work. But I'm glad that they told me that. But like, if you're giving feedback that you feel like isn't landing, that's an opportunity to maybe like probe them maybe more about what they're looking for or if they're looking for feedback. Like, I guess it kind of depends on the scenario. Like, is the feedback unsolicited? Are you providing a point of view that like wasn't yet asked for? Or do you just need to like build more rapport with that team specifically? Like, are there places where you could be a fly on the wall more so in their process, and learn more about their work and maybe sort of like come to an aligned understanding of vocabulary about like what you both do? Um, and then I think that sort of like helps each other understand better like what you're working on and how to comment on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally does. Another question from Bridget here. She's curious to learn your pros and cons for using Figma comments versus
Mm.
posted style cards throughout the file.
Yeah, I think like this kind of depends on the vibe of your team, but I really do think comments are helpful because you can have like a longer term conversation about something. Like, the comment can be left, and then because you can chain like replies, you could like ask more probing questions about the feedback or like get clarity on that feedback. I guess you could do the same thing on post-its. You could like add a comment to a post-it and have someone like at someone, but I don't know if like people are as diligent about like leaving their name like on the post-it. Um, I guess that kind of depends on like what style of critique. Maybe you want to do a critique that's like totally anonymous and like the feedback is anonymous. But I think like in a professional design environment, like at your office, it's helpful to know who to talk to because someone's feedback you might need more clarity on, or someone might be like in a position that you like are working with or collaborating with them. So you need the clarity from them. And the comments kind of provide that chain of record.
Yeah, this is a good follow-up from Angelina to this last question. It can be time-consuming to reply to every single Figma comment. So, how do you typically balance spending time explaining your designs and managing whether you should be just acknowledging the feedback, like saying thanks, and just addressing every single comment that's been left?
Yeah, I think like you should also kind of be aware of like the power dynamics of the project that you're doing. Like, definitely prioritize the folks whose work is sort of like impacting each other. If the work that you're doing, like say you have an engineer that you have a good relationship with that you invited into the critique who's asking you questions, if you were eventually going to do a handoff with this person, you should probably answer all of their questions. Like, understand who is like your inner sphere, I guess, your like inner clique of the work, I guess, are the people that you should always prioritize answering. Everyone else who's sort of living on the periphery might be like giving you really good advice, really good feedback, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to like follow up with every single one. But this sounds have like a good problem to have. I don't know if I have ever had like so many comments in a Figma file that I wasn't able to follow up on all of them. I'm like imagining that level of collaboration. It kind of sounds so ideal to me, but maybe it's a nightmare.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that. Um, you know, um, we're going a little over time here, so just want to be mindful of everyone's time, especially yours, Jen. Thanks everyone for asking so many great questions. Wanted to, Jen, put you on the spot one more time here and help us pick our winner for the $50 gift card that we're giving out today. If you can go through the Q&A and maybe pick which one was your favorite question that you answered, and then I'll drop in my email in the chat and the winner can contact me so I can share the information with them.
Yeah, I'm looking through the comments right now. I I really liked the question about doing them in person or online. I think that this is a really good like question that gets to the heart of like the vibe of critique. When is it helpful to do asynchronous? When is it helpful to do in person digitally? And then what is the purpose of critique in person too? Like a pinup versus a digital critique. And it also just made me really nostalgic. So
Right on. Cool. We have our winner then. With that said, wanted to spend some time just sharing a little this QR code with everyone here. If you have any feedback, I would really love to hear from you. This event's made by the community, so hearing your voice will help us really shape even better future experiences, and just make sure that we're addressing anything that you think that could be improved through every session that you've joined today. I've also wanted to take some time to just do a big shout out to everyone that's been involved here. If you've joined several sessions today, you've probably seen this slide around. It's probably one of my favorite ones because it shows every single chapter that's been part of, and it's really been big collaboration from a lot of people across the world to make this happen. And given that this is the last event, this is the last session of the event, I also wanted to take some time to give special thanks to the people who are behind this. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge, first of all, Pierluigi Russo, who's been leading the charge for this. None of this would have happened without his vision, coordination, and persistence. Big thanks as well to Mei Zhu, Kingwei Li for designing and building the beautiful website for this event, and for all of the behind-the-scenes magic they've contributed throughout. Also, big shout out to Preet Soni for being an early supporter of this, and given Pierluigi the confidence to start with this initiative. As well, also wanted to give a massive thank you to everyone that's been part of this event, all of the Figma leaders, as well as all of our speakers, Jen, you included, for supporting us in this huge initiative, volunteering your time, curating sessions, and sharing your voice. It's been an incredible event, and it's a true reflection of the passion and generosity that everyone has had to make this happen. Also wanted to say thanks to everyone that's joined. Really appreciate all the questions and engagement in this session and throughout this event. Just a reminder that all sessions have been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. But with that said, Jen, just wanted to say thanks to you one more time. Really appreciate your time today, and thanks everyone for joining, and hope you have a great rest of your evening. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.